Hi everyone, welcome. Yay! Thank you all so much for joining us for our event tonight with Sorayya Khan and Shanthi Sekaran celebrating We Take Our Cities With Us. Let's give it up for those. Exciting. Everyone came at the exact same time, ready to go, which is very exciting to see. We love seeing a full house out here for literature. Welcome to Green Apple Books on the Park. I have very brief business before we get to the fun part of the evening. Just wanted to encourage you to check out our full event calendar on our website at greenapplebooks.com/event. If you enjoy literary events such as the one you are attending this evening, which I think you might have like a personal bias, but you also might like other books. I have a feeling you do as well. You can check out our full calendar. We have some great stuff coming up in the rest of the season and the coming year. Thank you for buying books from us here, an independent bookstore in San Francisco. So much. We appreciate that. When you buy books from us, you not only support an independent bookstore, but you also support the writers that put so much work into writing these books, and then you get to have a book, which might be the best part. So thank you for doing that. We always appreciate it every time. And also thank you so much for keeping masks on during the event. I know it's a little odd on this strange kind of transitionary COVID time. We want to give our authors the grace to take theirs off during the event. We also do want you to imbibe. So if you can stand anymore, we want you to imbibe from what refreshments we do have. So we just ask that you keep your mask on between sips. If you do and think being cool about it. We're just trying to be celebratory, but also move forward safer. So we appreciate your help in that. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and introduce the authors that are joining us this evening. First, Shanthi Sekaran is a novelist and television writer. She most recently made her middle grade debut with The Samosa Rebellion, a winner of the Northern California Book Award. Congratulations. Her most recent adult novel, Lucky Boy, was named an Indie Next Great Read, a best book of 2017 by NPR, Barnes & Noble, Library Journal, and the SF Chronicle. She recently left a teaching career to join the writer's room of the acclaimed NBC medical drama New Amsterdam. She lives in Berkeley, California with her family and a cat named Frog. Let's give it up for Shanthi. And Sorayya Khan is the author of the novels City of Spies, 5 Queens Road, and Noor. The daughter of a Pakistani father and a Dutch mother, she was born in Europe, grew up in Pakistan, and now lives in Ithaca, New York with her family. Her memoir, We Take Our Cities With Us, is the reason we are here tonight. So let's give it up for Sorayya Khan.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out and joining us. It's such a wonderful crowd, such a good-looking crowd, right? And we're really, really happy to have you here, Sorayya. It's wonderful to have you in our city. So I would like for you to read to us. I'm sure we'd all like for you to read to us a little bit. And then we'll go into questions. I will ask questions of Sorayya, and then for like the last 10 or 15 minutes, we'll move into audience questions.
Thank you so much. Can everybody hear me? Okay, in the back. Thank you so much for all being here. I will read just the first couple of pages of the memoir to give you an idea of the voice and a little bit sketch of the story. My mother was white and my father was brown. My mother Dutch, my father Pakistani. If she'd had a choice, she would have been brown. She tried, sitting near swimming pools during short summers when we lived in Vienna, and long ones when we lived in Islamabad. But her attempts came to a full stop with basal cell carcinoma when sunscreen replaced sun as her best friend. My father's brown was constant, except that when he grew older and gray in a certain light and on a certain part of him, his color lightened. I am in between. I pretend I didn't know I was brown until we moved from Austria to Pakistan, and I saw it all around and made it mine. But my truth of color and country is complicated. Color is a fact for my American-born children. We didn't wake up one morning and decide our children were ready for the news. You're brown. Almost as soon as they could talk, they put their little arms next to mine and decided they were darker. They were always right, because when summer came and my color deepened, so did theirs, and our skin tone never matched. Next to their fathers, their arms and legs were not a match, but close enough. That's okay, our son said about my outsider status and patted my arm because they must have thought I needed comforting. Before long, they asked, where are we from? I'd say, you are from where we are from, Pakistan, and from where you were born, here. Naeem, my husband, would remember my mother and add, also from Holland, where Nani is from, which would surprise me because I'd forgotten. There is no flag for their combination, and anyway, the white in that equation, the 1/4 of them, that is my mother, was ignored even then. Nani is the brownest person we know, I heard them say once, as if they'd always known that color was a state of mind, not a pigment. My mother's allegiance to brown was resolute. She was forever on the side of the underdog, as if she'd lived it coming of age in Amsterdam during World War II as a daughter, granddaughter, and great-granddaughter of white Catholics. She'd half joke, I'm absolutely positive I have Arab blood in me. And then react to our skepticism with, now, don't you forget about the Arabs in Spain or the war between the Dutch and Spanish. She threw around history the way all of us had been thrown around the world. I knew then that history lived alongside us, but until she was gone, I didn't understand that her history lived there as well. She was right. You cannot leave history behind. But when you are the daughter of my mother, Tera, you cannot leave her behind either.
Thank you for that. That was beautiful. Just in reference to that passage that you just read. So early in the passage, you say that for your sons, color is a fact, and for your mother, color is a state of mind. I find that interesting, that difference in perception. I'm wondering, what is color for you?
Oh, very interesting question. I think color over time has become fact, right? But I think initially, the way I thought about color was very different. When we were children and we were growing up, my father used to say to us very firmly, you have the best of both worlds, right? This was his ongoing mantra. And I used to think that if I could just figure out where that place, best of both worlds was, I would have my roots, right? And I think that in that imagining of where I came from, color at that stage didn't factor in. But as I grew older, I thought of color more as a mishmash. And when color became politicized for me, actually, I think when I was a teenager, that's when I think I started to think about color as this combination of state of mind, politics, and pigment.
Yeah, it does. And can you talk a little bit about color becoming politicized for you as a teenager?
Yes, I can. I mean, I grew up I was born in Vienna, in Austria, in Europe, and we went to an international school there actually wasn't mostly Western. It included people from all over the world, right? Because it's such a large international UN community there, and we were part of that school. And then when we made the move from Vienna to Pakistan, it was a question of what school would we attend, right? And I think initially my father had the idea that maybe we would go to Pakistani schools, but we didn't qualify for Pakistani schools because we didn't speak the language, right? And so then we went to an international school in Islamabad. It was very different. It was mostly white, and that the Pakistanis that attended when I was there, now it's very different, were very few. And I think that that was my awakening that I was actually not white, although I felt at home there. It was very, it was there was a tension there, right? So I think that being in that environment over time, now when I look back on it, I think about that time as being formative and educating me in terms of race and color and what politics and how politics intersects with that.
Right. Okay. And just so we get the quick summary of where you've been in your life. So you were born in Vienna.
Yes, so I was born in Vienna. We moved to Pakistan when I was 10 years old. I lived in Pakistan until I was 17 and graduated and went to college in the US in this small little town in Pennsylvania where I couldn't understand why people didn't know where Pakistan was. So that started my trajectory.
I can relate.
Can you?
Yeah, I grew up in Sacramento, and like India still wasn't really known. And India is it's a large portion of the world population.
I remember when I first landed in Meadville, Pennsylvania. I went to a small college called Allegheny College. And the first couple of weeks, I was walking to the post office and I was joined by this fellow, I don't even remember his name. He was saying, "Where are you from?" And I said, "We're from Pakistan." And he said, at that time, I thought everybody knew where Pakistan was. He said, "I know where that is. That's right next to Egypt, right?" And I thought, first I was offended, but I thought, he's not all wrong. It's a lot closer to Egypt than we are now.
I remember that part. You were very kind to him.
I didn't know very much then. That was
Right. Sometimes it's okay to be kind. So just to back up a little bit, you started your writing life as a novelist. Is that right?
That's right.
Okay. And then what sort of made you move into memoir, and what compelled you to do that? Do you think you'll go back to novels?
Well, the impetus for writing the memoir actually comes from a question that, as you know, novelists are asked very often, which is how much of your novel is true or what parts really happened. And I grappled with that question a lot after my last novel, which is written in first person as if memoir, but is not. And so I decided to tackle what happened, my story, head on, initially really more as an experiment, just to see how that might unfold on the page. But that time coincided with my mother's illness and eventually her passing away. But it also coincides with this moment this polarized moment we all find ourselves in when borders are being erected everywhere. And we speak of identity as if it's a fixed and unchanging thing. And given my own heritage, I was interested in thinking about the multiplicity of identity. And only recently have I really become interested in the Dutch part of me. And I wanted to think about identity as a more flexible category, right? That we might change or adapt over time, or in response to much larger political events that we do not have control over, like 9/11. And for me, as a child, the hanging of the prime minister in Pakistan, and losing parents. So it's ironic that my my movement to memoir comes from a question that novelists are asked.
Right.
But that's kind of a
Yeah, that was
long
the
story of
impetus.
how it came. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, and what was it like? Can you remember the day that you decided to sit down and write this? Was there, is it even possible to pinpoint that decision?
It is possible to pinpoint because I very clearly, as a result of writing City of Spies and doing events, as you know, it's very common for novelists to be asked, for novelists to be asked, which character are you? Right. And in City of Spies, it's like a difficult thing to respond to because I had drawn on parts of my childhood, but I was always trying to explain this separation. So I thought, if I could just write that story for myself, I would have a better answer when people ask me that question. Right. And so one day I decided to try to do that. But instead of doing that for City of Spies, which at that time was my most recent novel, I thought, let me do that for a different novel. So I did that for Five Queens Road, which is my second novel. And that essay is actually, so then I sat down and I wrote this essay, and it's about my mother's relationship to Lahore and my grandparents' home, Five Queens Road. And that essay is actually in here. That was one of the earliest pieces.
Right. Okay. So Five Queens Road, it's in the book. It's a very memorable place. It has a whole history to it. It's almost, a sort of capsule of partition in and of itself. Like one part of it it's owned by a Hindu owner, and then there's like a line drawn down the middle, and the other side of the home is lived in by your family. So yeah, it's it's in a very interesting part of the book. I won't spoil anything there. Can you talk about the homes in this memoir? Like what home is to you, the houses in it?
I think that I didn't really realize what an import houses had until I wrote this book, except for Five Queens Road, because Five Queens Road has been such a fertile place for my imagination as a writer. I've drawn on that in so many different instances. But when I wrote this book, our house in Islamabad, the houses that I've lived in since, and the apartment that my mother grew up in, these various locations, right, unfolded as I think of now. I just have this image, on Google Maps, when you're looking for a place, how you can draw from a pin, right? And so those places became my little pins that located me in the world. And I think that houses is how I mapped my journey. Right? I think so.
Yeah, so in a way, the countries that you lived in, really it was the houses. The house was the country for you.
I think so. Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah.
And also, if I could just add that when the generation above you, when they pass away, right, we don't have them anymore, but we have their places, right? And I think that those places took on a different kind of import in the writing of this book, because the people that I was writing about are no longer alive.
Yeah, so they've taken up residence in this book.
Yes, that's the way to say it.
Yeah. So speaking of earlier generations, there's a beautiful passage about your grandmother that I would love for you to read. It's another short passage, but it's really evocative and very physical. I'd love for you to read that.
So this passage takes place in Lahore, and the grandmother that we're talking about is my father's mother. My grandmother combed her striking white hair into a tight bun, and as she aged and her hair thinned, the teeth of her comb left behind wider lines of scalp. Her waking hours were spent low to the ground, either on her prayer carpet in private communion with God, or crouched on a wooden pewee preparing the next meal. Sometimes she invited us to help clean the rice and lentils. We dropped beside her to pick out tiny stones and bits of dried pods before dragging the heavy bowls across the stone floor to the spigot to fill them with water. Together, we swirled rice and lentils between our fingers until the water ran clean or we lost interest. Afternoon light danced on the rippling water in the tins, and our hands melted into hers. She had age spots and wrinkled hands and raised veins that crisscrossed her ankles. She was concealed in white cotton shalwars and lightly printed chemises, and I was left to imagine her elbows and knees. But there were other ways to know her body. During lazy afternoons when she chose not to retire to her room for a nap, my grandmother lay face down on the living room floor without the benefit of our thin mattresses rolled up and tucked in a corner, and waited for me to notice. She taught me to massage her by walking on her, and I mastered a sidestep shuffle that began on her buttocks and ended at the end of one leg before starting up on the other. Walking on her legs was like navigating a living balance beam. I fought until the last second, arms flailing, finally falling and waiting for my grandmother to indicate where she wanted me to begin again. She groaned with joy as I sank my weight into her, and I can still summon the odd intimacy. Her buttocks were jelly, slipping underneath as I attempted to gain a foothold. Her tiny calves were mostly bone. The delicate groove behind her knee was designed for my childhood feet. I remember dropping to a crouch to check on her when she went quiet or her eyes stayed closed for too long, and my head scraping my grandfather's stack of Reader's Digests, which were always the same, and my mother, Omar, and I all read. Near her face, I felt whispers of prayer, but I still worried that my feet had kneaded the life out of her.
That's lovely. Thank you. What struck me about that passage was how physical it was, how much it functioned through the body. Can you talk to us about writing that passage in particular, sort of how you were able to re-access that detail?
I don't know really if I have a right answer. If I have a good answer for that, I will try. I think what happened was I was trying to recall, I was trying to write about the architecture of the living room in 5 Queens Road. And the room was really large, and it doubled as our bedroom at night, with these thin mattresses and eyes that were tucked around in the corner. And when I was trying to write about that space and the peeling paint and these doorways that had been filled in with closets to separate one part of the house from the other, there were all these details, but I kept coming back to the floor, and I couldn't remember what the carpet of the floor looked like, but I could remember my grandmother's white shalwars against it, So I think that's how I began to imagine it, because I didn't think I would ever write such a passage, I didn't imagine that, first of all, I didn't know that I remembered doing that massage until I remembered what my grandmother looked like, face down on the floor, waiting for us to give her this sort of massage. And interestingly, I wasn't actually the only one. There were many cousins among us. And I remember a year or two ago speaking to, just chatting with a cohort of cousins about my age. And they said, you weren't the only one. We all used to do that. I don't remember that. so we compared notes at the time, but by then I had written the passage.
Yeah.
So,
Okay.
yeah.
That's the thing, when you're the writer, then you get to be the it's a very intimate passage, right? Did it
Right.
surprise you, like sort of going that sort of like that route of this very intense bodily intimacy with the figure of your grandmother?
Yeah, because I remembered, I carried that memory of what it felt like to walk up and down her thighs in particular, and how I would almost fall off between. She was such a small woman, you know, and the fact now I look back that she was allowing children to walk up and down her, you know, her legs must really have hurt to ask us to do that. But I remembered that sensation, and I remembered how small she was, you know, and how her bones felt against my feet. And I remember feeling, even as a child, the odd intimacy of that. And I remember taking that away from it. You know, I didn't think of it again, right? But it was easy to conjure up that memory when I recall that.
Yeah. And speaking of conjuring up memory, how does one do that? I've never written a memoir. So how does one do that for a memoir? I mean, some of the detail in here is just very, very intricate, very clear. So is there, you know, as part of that storytelling, I know that I've read that memory in our brains comes from the same place that invention does. Can you talk to us about sort of recalling your details and how that happens?
I think that those kinds of details for me come from the same place that those details come from being a novelist. And I say that because I think of myself now as a very visual writer and have always been that way. So images have really helped me imagine place and imagine details. So I remember, for example, but when I was writing Noor, which was my first novel, I did research in Bangladesh for it, and I took some photographs. And one photograph was of these oil barrels, for lack of better words, these oil barrels against a peeling brick wall. And the oil barrels were multiple colors, like light blue and green and red. There were about 9 of them stacked up against this brick wall. And I took a picture of that. And that picture sat on my desk the whole time that I wrote Noor, even though there's no scene in Noor about those barrels. Those barrels don't feature. But whenever I found myself getting stuck in the story and being unable to conjure up a scene, I would look at that photograph and I would all of a sudden recall, the glass encased bulletin board not far away where newspapers used to be tacked up, or the buffalo running by, or the rickshaws. I would hear things. And that image was grounding for me in that way. So, and I've had that experience with different images in all my novels. And so it felt natural when I was writing the memoir to think of images in the same way. And one of the sources for me was these photo albums that I inherited from my mother. And one of them was her mother's photo album from when she was a child. And so the photo album is basically almost falling apart, but I would look at those pictures, and then there would be little details that would capture my attention and help ground me in the world that I was trying to build. So it's this combination of imagination and actual images from archives, from family archives, or from other people's books or other people's photographs.
Okay, so there are elements like photographs and just sort of landmarks of memory that helped to conjure up the surrounding world.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, the conjuring comes from someplace, not just from what I imagine. I was very much helped along by visual images that I found elsewhere in libraries, old photographs. When I wrote Five Queens Road, for example, I remember going to a exhibit with my brother in Rochester. I don't know if you recall, we went to see Margaret Bork White's exhibit in Rochester, right? And I remember photographs that we took there helping me imagine the day of partition. So, I mean, it's probably not so different. I should ask you this question because, novelists, I think, tend to rely on different, different sensory memories and artifacts to help us along.
Yeah, I think I definitely draw from it's kind of, when I'm writing a novel, like I can use anything from anywhere, unless I'm trying to conjure a specific place or event. So yeah, I use, it's usually a pick and mix of various memories and impulses and, so yeah, okay. What I wanted to ask about in relation to your mother was this thing you say early on in the book. You talk about there's an incident at your kids' school. It's after 9/11. They're being bullied by a kid at their school. And you say in the book that you hesitated to tell your mother about it, or you actually didn't tell your mother about it. Because for you, it still felt small. It felt like a small struggle compared to what she had been through in her life. And I find that interesting and I relate to it because my parents are immigrants and I often feel like no matter what I'm going through, like it's peanuts compared to what they did. So can you talk about that sort of comparison in size of struggle between immigrant parents and their offspring?
Sure. I don't know if I have a good answer for that, but being the daughter of a father who saw partition, right, in which millions of people died in tremendous political upheaval and otherwise, and the daughter of a mother who witnessed World War II. I mean, these are really monumental events, right? And 9/11 is a monumental event in this country, but still, when you think of it in comparison to these sorts of events, I'm not sure, where how it falls on the scale, right? And I think in my mind that must have been part of that. And also, and maybe that has something to do with the burden of being an immigrant and always thinking that, even though I don't like that word very much, but just in this particular instant that our struggles are not necessarily comparable to our parents' struggles, right? But also maybe perhaps that just another thought that occurs to me is that my mother was an exceptionally strong person, actually. And maybe I felt that my inability to manage the situation that felt sometimes like it was spiraling out of control, maybe I was, ashamed that I couldn't do a better job at managing that. And so I didn't necessarily want to share that with her. She'd say, sweetheart, why don't you just do what needs to be done?
Yeah. Yeah. Although she must have struggled in her time. Right. Yeah. Speaking of, what was I going to ask you? Speaking of memory, going back to your early days in Pakistan at 5 Queens Road.
Yeah.
There's a there's a girl that you become friends with, right? She's the daughter of one of the sweeper families.
Yes.
So at 5 Queens Road, just a small detail, it's kind of like a conglomeration of various sectors of society, right? You have your family, you have the Hindu family, and you have a sweeper colony, and you have
Car shop settlement.
the car shop settlement, and you become friends how old were you then?
Must have been maybe 6 or 7.
Okay, so 6 or 7, pretty young, but you become friends with a girl about your age, and she's the daughter of a sweeper. And as kids, you don't notice who belongs to who, you just play. And then there's a scene where you go to her house, and one of the aunties is basically just like yelling at you guys, like, what are you doing playing together? Can you talk about maybe race, not race, but class and your awareness of it, maybe as a child versus what it was like as you grew up?
Well, in this particular incident, so 5 Queens Road it's a residential dwelling, right? And the house is being encroached upon on all sides by different settlements. There's a car shop settlement on one side, and on another side, only separated by a narrowing every year, becoming smaller, narrower and narrower driveway. There's my grandfather's office abuts the driveway, and directly across from the driveway is this mud wall, which surrounds the sweepers, what we used to call the sweepers colony. And one day, the sweeper's daughter, she used to accompany her mother to come and clean 5 Queens Road floors. And we're playing in the yard, in the lawn, and I don't know how it happened, but we were holding hands and playing, and she, we ran outside and into the sweeper colony. And none of the adults paid very much attention to us when we were in 5 Queens Road. They were all busy doing their thing. But when we both appeared in the sweepers colony, running through the narrow alleyways, all of a sudden, I was really young, but it seemed to me like the whole world stopped. Everybody was suddenly paying attention to us, not at all that I was there, that something had gone wrong, right? And then we stopped, we were just about to enter her little dwelling, and the dwelling didn't have a door, it had these long strings of beads that separated the outside from the inside. She was just about to pull me in when some woman just standing very close by, who was washing clothes, figured out that who I was, and was furious that the other little girl had brought me in there, and gave us a serious shout. And we both went running out of the sweepers colony somehow. And when we got to the other side, my grandfather was standing there, and he blasted both of us. And I was then punished and had to go and sit in his bedroom for a couple of hours. And it was a very confusing time because I couldn't figure out why it was not okay for me to be there, but my friend lived there. It was just very odd, right? I never got a very straight answer from that, but I remember that being one of my first sort of experiences really with class, although of course for me then I didn't know what it was, right? I couldn't figure it out, right? But that was, I'm sorry.
Yeah, that's the answer. That's a good answer.
Yeah. It had to do with my experience of class, right? So that was
Right.
I think that's actually my first memory of that.
Of negotiating class.
Yeah, although in all our trips back to Pakistan, when we were very small, there was always a class on me because there were servants doing things that everybody else would do. So class in that way was always accepted, but this somehow was so immediate and so of the same. We were the same ages.
Yeah.
That made a difference.
And you had been operating on the assumption that you were equals.
Exactly.
And you could move between each other's homes.
Yeah, exactly.
And that was not the case,
Yeah.
apparently.
apparently not.
Yeah.
For reasons nobody thinks of.
Yeah. So what's your relationship now with Pakistan and with the Netherlands and Vienna, maybe? These places that you've been in your life, like what are they to you now?
I think of all these places now really as the map of my life. You know, after really thinking long about where my roots are, I think about all these places now as interconnected. And I think about interconnectedness as a premise for identity, rather than just having to select one particular place to feel most rooted from. And I think that now that's a result of my parents no longer being alive. Because as long as my parents were alive, you know, their homes are always your home, right? And so now that they're not alive anymore, I think that my relationship to these places has become something different, you know, unexpectedly.
Has it become closer, more distant, more urgent in a way?
Interestingly, I mean, only recently have I become more interested in the Dutch part of it. So Holland for me has become much more real since I began doing the research for the memoir, right? Then my husband and I went to Holland to do the research, and I went into this archive in Maastricht and was able to find my great-grandfather's birth certificate. It was such an amazing moment because so first of all, one of the things that the Dutch do that's really incredible is they have all these churches, but they don't know what to do with it because they don't know what to do with them because people don't worship in the same way anymore. And so they've transformed churches into bookstores. And in Maastricht, they've turned this incredible church into an archive. So go in there. You know, archives are anyway mysteriously religious places, and that it's housed in this church. So anyway, it was pretty amazing to find that birth certificate in microfilm in that location. So Maastricht became something different for me when I went there and when I discovered where my great grandparents had married, you know. So through the pull of research, I pulled these places closer to me. Of course, Pakistan always remains, I think, my heart and home in a way that other places can't compete with. But other places are now rising, you know, and becoming more important as kind of connective tissue. You know?
Right. Yes. Wonderful. Well, thank you for speaking with me.
Well, thank you so much for being with me.
I would love to open the floor to audience questions. Yes.
Right. The last part of it has been very intriguing in terms of your identity and how you relate to the old places you've lived in, grew up in. Obviously, you've spent the majority of your life here. I understand you moved to the States when you were 17. You've been here ever since. How does the U.S. fit into your story and your journey?
I'm just going to repeat the question for our people on Zoom. How does the U.S., with all the places you've lived and having ended up here, how does the U.S. Fit into your journey? Is that it? Yeah.
Your sense of identity.
And your sense of identity.
Yeah, you know, it is ironic, isn't it, that I've been in this country for so long, and I very much hesitate to use the word immigrant. I really don't like that word, and I don't really know how to explain why I have such hesitancy in terms of incorporating that into my identity. And I think that, you know, it's complicated. And part of it has to do with my political relationship with this country and how I felt as a child in the 1970s with what was happening in Pakistan and how the US played a role in South Asia and how the US continues to play an imperial role or the role of empire in the world. it's difficult for me to align myself with, it's difficult for me to align my heart with that. And I think that that's where my hesitancy comes from. And so having children who are born here, you know, and they are American, you know, that's fine. That's like a different, I don't have any issue with that. But we have tried to raise them to think about, instead of being rooted in this country, being rooted in the world. And that has been very important to us as parents, to try and bestow upon them a sense of the world, which is very hard to do when you live in the US, because in the US, being assimilated is it's so important for survival, you know? So, but we've managed, because we've managed to maintain relationships with our siblings and with our cousins, and, you know, for many years with our parents in different places. I don't know if that really
Maybe
answers.
that's a small follow. I hear that from a lot of different
Yeah.
I know you don't like the word. But yet, you know, we say home is here, home is there, or home is the journey. How is that trip staying here for 50 years?
Meaning, why shouldn't this be home?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of conflict about being here, political conflict. How does one reconcile that? with having made the decision to live in the market? And I haven't read your books. If I'm going off script.
I mean, I don't know, must one reconcile, you know? I'm not sure. I mean, for me, I think that being on the edge and thinking about these questions is important, in making decisions about where to call home and what place should be primary home. I don't know if that's necessary. And I think that writing a book like this is a way of mapping a global world and imagining coming from multiple places as being the world of home. You know, it's, I guess my not hesitancy, but I prefer not to affiliate with a particular nation at a particular time. Now I'm at a place where I'd rather think about being a citizen of the world.
A quick question. Soraya, where did your parents meet?
Where did your parents meet? That's the question.
They met in Chicago.
In
My
Chicago.
They met in Chicago. My mother came to study in Chicago, and my father was working around Chicago.
Okay.
So, yeah, they met in Chicago, and they married in Washington, D.C.
Wow. Okay.
They wanted to marry in North Carolina, where my father had gone to graduate school, but because of the misogyny laws,
Yeah.
they couldn't marry there. So they married in DC. And they were one of the first, I don't know, maybe, Omar, you remember, the first couple to marry in the new mosque in Washington, DC. And a few years ago, we went there
Oh,
to try and find their name in the registry, but the fellow who was operating the registry and in charge, he just had no idea what the papers were. So I don't even know if there's a record of that.
That's historic. I saw a question here. Yes.
So now, having written a memoir, in the sense getting it out of your system, does that free up part of your brain, your creative mind for your next novel in a sense?
So does writing a memoir free up, or did writing a memoir free up some creative part of your brain for another novel?
Thank you for asking that question, because I'm so happy to answer it and to be able to say yes. And it just, because I'm so happy to be back to writing novels, really. But the surprise really is that one of the surprises of writing, there are many surprises I had as a result of writing the memoir. And one of them is that when I sat down to write this, I had no idea that it would be so much about my mother or that it would be so much about us, right? But the more I wrote it, the more I thought, I have to write this and I have to allow it to be a grief memoir in addition to what I was trying to do. Because if I didn't write about loss now, I would only ever write about loss in my novels. And I didn't want to do that. So I thought if I could get it all out in this, then I could turn to doing something completely different, which is what I want to do, which is what I'm working on now. So, yeah.
You have the glow of a novelist who's writing a novel.
Although you know it's all on hold now.
If I can
Yeah.
remember how to do it.
Right, when you get back. Yeah. More questions? Who else? Yes.
It's not very cogent in my head, but I'll see if I can ask in a decent way. You've been living in Cornell for a while now, and it's a small town. And having lived in a small town affects the way you experience the country that's your adopted country. If you were living in New York City, I imagine that would shape your thinking, not just the political thinking. Being a person of color, you are already politicized with what's happening to your kids, and you're surrounded by mostly white people and whatnot and all that stuff. Do you feel that after having lived here for such a long time, that your family's life is actually affected more by what's happening here, so to speak? Do you see the focus of your writing shifting to American issues? And I raise this question because Shanti's novel, Lucky Boy, actually deals with that. And I don't know if you know, but I wrote a little bit about your novel.
Yeah.
And she does this very interesting thing where she takes the whiteness out of the equation. It is there because that's the overarching setup. But she very interestingly picks Indian immigrant family, or I think they were born and raised here, but they're basically first generation Indian Americans versus Mexican Americans, where one of the mother is not actually born and raised here. So it was a very interesting political choice that some of us South Asian writers precisely are dealing with that tension. But there's an industry pressure to, some critics are calling it neo-Orientalism, where, okay, white men can't do it anymore, but we'll do it in a much more complicated way. We'll show you how political a mango is, that kind of stuff, whatnot. So anyway, but some of us are actually really starting to take on America. Okay, let Gitanjali Shri write about India and whatnot. We're here, we're going to deal with the country that we live in. Have those thoughts crossed your mind? That you deal with these things?
So we're talking about, with all your global experience and having written about global settings, are you going to be taking on America?
I don't know, because as you know, as writers, we don't always know what our next project is. So who knows? I am now working on a novel that for the first time, Pakistan doesn't feature in it at all. And 10 years ago, I could never have imagined that I would be interested in doing that. So I don't want to say never, but I'm not necessarily, I don't think right now that I'm interested in doing that. I am much more interested in thinking about the world outside of the US as a writer, and also maybe one day if I ever return to nonfiction, my interest in my subject matter, some ideas I have, my subject matter would be outside the US. So I don't know. Wasn't talked to me in 10 years.
It's a larger conversation.
It is, yeah, yeah.
I think we have time for one more question. Yes.
So Sorayya, I learned this evening that you and Omar and Aisha are all authors. I'm curious to know, are your boys going to write, or are they have an interest in that?
So are your boys gonna be writers, or are they?
Neither of them are writers, and both of them swear that they will never write a book. So no, I don't. But never, who knows, right? But that's what they're saying at the moment.
You never know.
You never know.
And what's next for you? Just to cap off our discussion, you're working on a novel.
I'm working on a novel,
And that's the foreseeable future.
and that's the foreseeable future. And I hesitate to say too much about it, except that Pakistan doesn't feature in it, and I'm dying to get back to it. And I've had to put it away for a few months because of all, this book coming out. But, interestingly, being a novelist, we didn't talk about this, I just mentioned it last thing. Being a novelist really helped me to write the memoir. And I began writing this new novel, pieces of it, while I was doing revisions for the memoir. So I was thankful for this possible new project, for feeding into this, just in terms of craft.
Yeah. So was it the revision that helped you move
Yeah,
on? Okay, that's interesting. Usually I hate revisions, so maybe there's something to it.
So start writing memoir and use the memoir to go back to
Okay,
it.
Sorayya, thank you so much for being here. Thank you everyone for joining us tonight. Signing books, is that right? Over at the front of the store? Yeah, great, thank you.
Can we give one more hand to Sorayya Khan? Oh, I just said Shanthi Sekaran. One more hand for Shanthi Sekaran. Well, thank you all so much for joining us. I'm deeply appreciative to both of you for joining us and to all of you for celebrating this book with us this evening. We have copies of both of our authors' books available at the front. You can find them there. And I'm going to have them standing where my colleague Claire is. Claire, can you wave to them? At the back desk if you would like your big sign. If you need to know where to go, I would gladly tell you. If not, make yourself comfortable and meet us next time.
And thank you, Carl.